On May 5, 1818, Karl Marx was born, and 2 years following that, Friedrich Engels was born on November 28, 1820. Both were highly educated men that focused on the class structure of society and its inevitable conflict. Engels would write anonymous pieces to the Rheinische Zeitung, a German newspaper, which Marx was an editor for. Engels caught the attention of Marx when he submitted an article about exploitation of factory workers. Up until this point, they had no contact with each other. They would meet for the first time in November of 1842, and from there begin collaborating together. Though known best for their work, the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels analyzed the civil conflict in America extensively from the safety of their residence in England, the pair having fled from their German homeland following the failed democratic revolutions of 1848. Marx wrote for 2 newspapers, the New York Daily Tribune and the Viennese Die Presse, with Engels also contributing under Marx's name. Marx began writing for the Tribune in 1852 and published 350 articles, with Engels supplying another 125. The 2 men jointly wrote 12 articles up until the paper terminated Marx's employment in 1862. For Marx and Engels, the American Civil War was a revolution against slavery that destroyed the slave owners' power as a class. The present struggle between the South and North is nothing but a struggle between 2 social systems, between the system of slavery and the system of free labor. Both men saw the war as an extension of the American Revolution of 1776, arguing that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the North's arming of former slaves transformed the Civil War from a purely constitutional war into a revolutionary one. Although they did not characterize the Civil War as an outright revolution, Marx and Engels did believe that it advanced the cause of all workers, both white and black, by destroying chattel slavery. In regard to Marx specifically, his communist values did not preclude him from understanding that the abolition of slavery was not a plausible proposal upon Lincoln's rise to the presidency in 1860. Indeed, part of the reason that the Lincoln administration chose not to set slavery's destruction as an immediate war aim in the first place is because the majority of white Americans were not convinced of the concept's success. If Lincoln would have had emancipation of the slaves as his motto at that time, there can be no doubt that he would have been defeated. This being said, Marx viewed the war not as one of Northern aggression as Southerners saw it, but rather one of Southern aggression, through which the planter class hoped to preserve its political dominance. In his eyes, the War of the Southern Confederacy is not a war of defense, but a war of conquest for the spread and perpetuation of slavery. Essentially, if slavery were contained in the existing slave states, Marx contended, it would go into economic decline and slave owners would ultimately fall behind in political power to the emerging Northern capitalists. As a result of this, a rift would inevitably arise between the slaveholders and the poor whites, who would no longer have the chance of becoming masters themselves. Thus, the containment of slavery would jeopardize the compatible relationship of the ruling slaveholder class and the poor whites, a sentiment echoed in Marx's quote, that only by acquisition of new territories is it possible to square the interests of these poor whites with those of the slaveholders, to give their restless thirst for action a harmless direction, and to tame them with the prospect of one day becoming slaveholders themselves. It is important to mention that poor whites didn't thrive economically from blacks being enslaved, for the system actually hindered their economic development. Despite slavery being against their own class interests, however, poor whites continued to support the slave system, for although the majority of them were impoverished and lacked education, they recognized that they, at least, were not slaves.